Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. I wanted to put out a video on my thoughts of the state of Path of Exile 2 1 month in. I want to look at the good, I want to look at the bad, I want to look at the ugly, and give my overall thoughts so far. My overall recommendation, if you are sitting on the fence as to whether or not to try Path of Exile 2, is that it's almost in a buy-worthy state, but there's one major problem with it, and that is that the loot system is broken. We'll talk a lot more about this later. I think it is the one showstopper issue because once you get to about level 75, 77, 78, 79, somewhere around that point, past the campaign, but not too far past the campaign, you start having to do silly things in order to have any chance of getting realistically useful loot. And that ends up getting worse and worse. This is all due to the player-based magic find system, and it's jumped the shark in this game. It was a problem in Path of Exile 1. It destroyed Path of Exile 1's Calandra League. It seriously negatively affected the Necropolis League, the Scourge League, the Affliction League, but in Path of Exile 2, it is worse than it was in any of those leagues. And so my advice is just sit out until Grinding Gear Games fix it. That will be the moment at which I would say jump into Path of Exile 2 if you haven't already. There's also a lot of other problems that Magic Find is masking, and we will come to that later in this video when we start talking about some of the character power balance issues that are existing. More on that later. I just wanted to start though with one little tone-based disclaimer, I guess. This video is going to feel pretty negative. That's because I'm going to be focusing on the problems. I'm going to be focusing on the things that could take Path of Exile 2 from a B tier game to an A tier or an S tier game, and that probably will do so over the short to medium term. Now, I am genuinely enjoying POE 2 despite these teething issues, so this video is going to feel a little bit unfairly negative in some places, but I just wanted to clarify that that is indeed the case. I also think something we need to talk about is the interconnectedness of different elements of game design. We're going to talk a lot more about this later when we start talking about 1 portal, 6 portals, and various other things like that. But sometimes one design decision can change the direction of others, and player reactions to one design change can then have sweeping effects to a whole bunch of other systems you might not think of. Sometimes one change can ruin a lot of other systems, even though that individual change feels pretty good. I want to take as a little bit of an example on this. We'll elaborate more on this later. In Path of Exile 1, Grinding Gear Games made a decision that when you go to a final endgame boss, you get 6 attempts at that boss. Now, this is only in softcore. What the impact of this has been is that loot feels unrewarding from these bosses. There's a bunch of factors behind this, but basically, once you meet a certain character power threshold, there is no chance of failing one of these bosses. And that means that across the entire Trade League economy, people will bid up the cost of the entry token and bid down the value of the items until it is pretty much unrewarding to run these bosses. That's a problem Path of Exile 1 has. The cause of that is a decision, the game design decision, to let players have 6 attempts at these bosses. It means that you can guarantee you will almost always succeed once you attempt one of these bosses. POE 2 decides to go with a completely different design, and that's going to have consequences we will get to later. I also want to very quickly acknowledge that there have been really serious issues with cheating in Path of Exile 2. There's been 3 main types of cheating that have been going on. The first one has been item duplication. The second one has been the use of various cheating methods to roll back the results of crafting currency if you're unhappy with an RNG result. And the third one has been the really severe problem that this game has had with an infestation of cheat sites that offer currency for real world money. And most of this currency is stolen from other players. So there's been a lot of integrity issues with the game so far. I'm kind of confident that Grinding Gear Games can get on top of this. The problem that I see is that they're going to have to balance their resources between fixing these integrity problems and fixing some of the game design problems and fixing some of the technical problems in the game. It's not like it's the exact same personnel that would do all of these 3 things, but some key personnel would be involved in all of them, and that's going to be something that's going to cause delays in getting fixes. That's another reason, in case you needed it, to never patronize gold selling sites. Not only is it bannable cheating, not only is it funding account hacking, but it also causes Grinding Gear Games to have to put resources into fixing that problem and take those resources out of solving some of the design issues in the game. Anyways, Grinding Gear Games need to do better on this front. Early access standard is a complete mess. And this is a problem because for me, and I think anyone that's watching this video that gets to play the game more than 4 or 5 hours a week on average, we're quite happy to have a fresh start every 3 months. So we're quite happy to go back to the start, make a new character. But there are people who play the game less than us, and those people, their logical place that they would play the game is in early access standard. And early access standard has been pretty much ruined. All of the top merit tier items were either created through the use of flagrant cheats, or alternately, they have this shroud of suspicion. If they were created legitimately just through luck, then people are going to suspect for the rest of that item's existence that it was cheated. Additionally, Temporalis has been duplicated so much there were more than 1,000 of this item that was intended to be the top chase item in Path of Exile 2. There's more than 1,000 of them already, and this number is probably only going to get worse. And that's just the ones listed on trade. That's not counting the ones that people have got equipped on their characters. Now, among this more casual section of the player base, the people whose natural home is to play in early access standard, most of them are never going to own a mirrored copy of one of these items. They're never going to own a Temporalis. However, it is going to be the case that a lot of them are going to run the Fourth Sanctum, and some of them are going to get a miraculous Temporalis relic. Some of them are going to be running a map somewhere and get a miraculous Mirror of Kalandra drop. And then they're in this awkward spot where they've got this huge drop, but all the things they can get from it have this taint of cheating over them. And that's going to be something that I think will be an ongoing problem for the duration of the early access experience. So early access standard is never going to be a level playing field again, not even remotely fair. And this is going to be a real problem for that section of the player base that can only play 30 hours in a season, because they're the sort of people who would stay in early access standard rather than going into the new leagues and playing the game from a fresh start there, because they want to build up to the end game over several months. Okay, let's jump over to the best parts though, the campaign. I feel like in Path of Exile 1, after you've done maybe 4 or 5 zones, your character is always more powerful in the content you're running. And this makes the acts 2 things. It makes them fast, and it makes them dull. There's no exciting moments in the campaign unless you do something ridiculous, like try and get massively underlevel and kill one of the bosses at a crazily low level, but then you're actually punished for doing that with the in-game reward systems. I think there's a core gameplay loop in ARPGs, which is face monster, work out you need to be stronger to win, get stronger, then win. And then once you do win, you get to take loot off that monster that might make you stronger again. This core gameplay loop doesn't start in PoE 1 until endgame. It is there in the first couple of zones, but that's only there for that couple of zones. And then after that, it goes away. In Path of Exile 2, this is not the case. This gameplay loop works well from about level 1 to about level 78. Now, I'm guessing 78. You'll hear me say 75, 77, 78, 80. Basically somewhere around the point that you start breaking into yellow maps. That is when I think the game starts to have some real problems start to build up in it. Now, this doesn't mean the campaign is perfect. It's unclear to players what they're meant to do if they fall behind the expected power curve. There is a correct answer here. That is either to trade into more power if you're playing in Trade League. If you're in Solo Self-Found, it's to repeat zone bosses. Or if you're in the right level range, it's to repeat things like the Sanctum content that give you a bunch of good rares. In Path of Exile 1, the solution would be to farm gem levels, and to do that in areas that have a smooth layout. For instance, if you find yourself in Act 3 in Path of Exile 1, you can't beat Piety, she's just too tough for you, then you can go and farm better loot over in the docks. If you find yourself in Act 9, and you can't get through some of the earlier zones there, then you can go back to Act 8's Harbour Bridge, or you can go to Act 9's Blood Aqueducts, both of which have a lot of monsters in them. You can just go through, farm gem levels, farm some character XP, maybe you'll get a couple of good drops as well. That sort of thing can help you power up your character in order to get over any hurdles you might have hit. And of course, veteran players aren't hitting those hurdles at all. In Path of Exile 2, though, it's just unclear what you're meant to do in this situation. The intuitively obvious thing of go and kill a lot of monsters doesn't really help you, and what you need to do is go and kill specific bosses. I also feel in the campaign there's a couple of zones that drag. Act 2 feels like it's maybe got 1 or 2 too many zones, and Act 3 has a couple of zones that drag as well. There's the maze where you keep pushing down levers that change around various water tracks in there. There's the Val Ruins. These feel like they drag a little bit too long. And there's probably 1 or 2 too many zones late in the act. I don't think these are massive problems. I just think they're little teething problems. Path of Exile 1 had them as well. There are a couple of zones that were trimmed out of Path of Exile 1 at various points. The absolute best part, though, is the bosses. I think Grinding Gear Games really nailed the bosses in Path of Exile 2. And one of the things that I think really exemplifies why, I saw an interview with a last Epoch developer recently, and they mentioned moments of triumph in games. These are times that you beat a challenge, but it's not something you beat on your first try. It's something you felt like you really earned it when you beat it. These moments of triumph, killing bosses in Path of Exile 2, most of them feel like a moment of triumph. There's a couple of them that feel really cheap, like Belbala in Act 2, I think has a lot of problems with it. But generally speaking, you get this real moment of triumph feel when you down a boss, especially harder bosses like Viper Napuatsi and the 3-act bosses. These 4 in particular really feel like a moment of triumph when you beat them, especially when you beat them on your first time through the campaign. Cruel difficulty is a slightly different story. Cruel difficulty is quite a bit easier than the normal difficulty for most people. There are definitely some people that are finding it the other way around, but most people find that their character is just more functional when it's in Cruel, and that they're having less trouble with the bosses on the second time through. This means the second time through is feeling like a victory lap at the moment, rather than a struggle that's punctuated by these huge moments of triumph, like the first trip through the campaign is. It'll be really interesting to see what it's like once we get good at the campaign, because I think something that's easy to forget is that we are all clueless at Path of Exile 2 at the moment. One thing I particularly like in Path of Exile 2 is that there's none of this condescending approach to new players you see in a lot of modern games. There's none of this, oh, you're new, aren't you? Well, we'll make everything trivial because you're not very good at the game and you can't handle failure, so we're going to treat you with kid gloves and we're going to shove down your face that we're treating you with kid gloves. This is the sort of thing where you get a kill 10 rats quest in an MMO or something along those lines, and your character's passive healing is more than the damage output of a rat. New players are instead treated as capable of improving, capable of learning, and they're pushed to do so from early on. And I think this is one of the real high points of Path of Exile 2. There's this idea that new players don't need to be protected from making mistakes, but they do need the tools to learn from those mistakes when they happen. I will say that a lot of these bosses do work better in the campaign than they do at endgame, because at endgame, player offense scales up far more than monster hit points do, and as a result, you're no longer having those 2-minute fights that become a moment of triumph when you win. Instead, you're having a 20-second fight with the boss is dead, you dodge a couple of dodge or die abilities, and then after that, you don't really feel like it's a moment of triumph. You feel like, oh yeah, that was a tanky monster, now let's move on, I didn't get the loot I was looking for. But in the campaign, I think they really smashed them. Another design decision I really want to talk up that Grundy Gear Games have made was the decision to put high minimum levels on gems. So, if you have a gem that is a level 20 gem, it has a minimum level of 90. If you have one that's level 19, its minimum level is 84. If you have one that's 18, its minimum level is 78. And this makes it so that you've got some exciting milestones to look forward to late in character progression, something that I feel was missing from Path of Exile 1. Now, this is only the case if you're playing a spellcaster. If you're playing a melee build, you might actually not want to use these higher tier gems, because most melee skills seem to gain 5% more damage but 10% more mana cost at high level when you go up by 1 gem level, and that's not something you necessarily want. But for spellcaster builds, I think it gives you something to look forward to as you're progressing through early endgame. I think this has worked really well for me. It's not a design decision I would have considered, but I think it's good to not be in a position where after you've gotten into endgame and run your first 5 or 10 maps in Path of Exile 1, you can then just trade for the best gems in the game. Instead, those best gems are going to be locked out for quite some time until you work up to them, and that means that you've got more progression milestones to look forward to. So I have been singing the campaign's praises, but I do want to point out a couple of issues with it. Firstly, ascendancy trials are a huge untelegraphed difficulty spike. I have been sitting in some of the places that new players for Path of Exile 2 tend to hang out. So I'm in 1 or 2 of the Facebook groups, don't post very much there, but I do sit around there and have a look at some of the common complaints people raise. And one of them is that they find the ascendancy trials overwhelmingly difficult, but they feel like they have to get through them then and there. It's not clear to these players, it's not telegraphed to them, that you can just come back 5 levels later. You can continue with the game after killing Balbala, getting the coin, and getting access to the Trials of the Sekhemas. You can just go and do more of Act 2. Then when you've got the power, come back and beat the Sanctum content. Or in Act 3, when you get the Ultimatum encounter, then they feel like they're pressured to do it straight away. Whereas actually, Doriani, at the end of Act 3, level 45 zone, was easier than the Ultimatum trials at level 38 were. So this is not telegraphed to players. There's this huge difficulty spike. It's not optional content, it is mandatory to do it, but it is something that you can just sit on for a little while. It's not going to block your progress, and that's exactly what you should do. So ultimately, I think there's this problem where the game is telling you to do this quest, but not clarifying that this is one of those quests you can, and probably should in many cases if you're a new player, come back to a little bit later. Another thing that is a bit of a campaign gripe is it's just not that clear what to do if you fall behind the power curve. I did mention this before. What you should be doing is farming rare or unique monsters for loot, and unique monsters are more reliable. So you should be going and killing unique monsters somewhere, or alternately killing rare monsters somewhere. This will solve your problems. This will bail you out, but people aren't realizing this, and instead they're trying to grind levels, which is generally done by killing normal and magic monsters instead. This is not the strategy, and it's somewhat of a dead end people are falling into. Okay, so we've talked about the high points, the campaign. Let's talk about the low points. Let's talk about the loot systems. Loot is why maps aren't really working all that well. That's my assessment of the game so far. Early on, item progression in Path of Exile 2 tends to look like this. You loot a rare item that's on a usable base. You're using an out-leveled rare in that slot at the moment, and the new one, you know already it's probably going to be an upgrade if there's any connection between the stats that it rolls and the character that you're playing. And then if it's really good, you might even throw additional currency on it, you might exalt it, you might add quality to it if it's in one of the slots that accepts quality, you might apply an Artificer's Orb and then a rune. All these sorts of little other options that you've got to polish off something that's already somewhat usable. That's the gameplay loop in the campaign. Now you go up in zone levels fast while you're in the campaign. If your last rare amulet was 10 zone levels ago, then a new one is exciting. It might ID poorly, but at least it has a real chance to be good. That starts to change when you stop going up zone levels as fast. So once you get to maps, you stop going up in item levels as quickly. You start getting more rare items in each slot before you push up in tiers. At endgame, it's no longer sufficient for a rare to be in the best 1/3 of stats for its item level. Imagine that you have got a 92nd percentile rare. So this is one that is better than 92% of all rares at the same item level. And this is your amulet. It's equipped at the moment. And then you get a 91st percentile 1 drop. Now in this context, this amulet is not loot once you identify it, even though it's almost as good as what you're wearing. It's too common to trade away because other people have got better ones already, flooded the market with them, but it's also too weak to equip on your character. And this is the sort of problem that we see where you hit this point where loot stops being exciting loot because you're not going up in item levels as quickly. Now, this is something that all games are going to face, but there's a little bit more that comes online here. Grinding Gear Games tried to fix this issue with Magic Find. So this is increased item rarity as a player stat. And by doing this, they caused Path of Exile 2's biggest problem. The theory is that you get more rare items, so you got a better chance to have, say, a top 6% rare, which would be better than your 92nd percentile one. And some of your rare items that drop get tiered up to an unidentified tier 2 or an unidentified tier 3 item, and these are much more likely to be good. However, there is a real problem, and I want to call to your attention a Path of Exile 1 unique item, one that no one uses, one that won't show up on your loot filter in Path of Exile 1 in pretty much any circumstances, in order to discuss this further. Voidhome is a POE 1 item that it's just offensive stats as a weapon. At the time that you get them, they're amazing. 150% increased physical damage, doesn't have any flat physical damage, but 50% increased attack speed. This is a really high DPS weapon at the time that you get it. Now, it's something that you can obsolete through an amazing rare, but the reason no one ever uses Voidhome, not even as a leveling item, is because it undermines your loot and XP progression on it. 50 to 30% reduced rarity on it, 50 to 30% reduced experience gain. This is why it's widely considered one of the 10 worst Path of Exile 1 uniques. Now, I want to make the case that in Path of Exile 2, any gear item that has powerful baseline stats but doesn't have rarity, and it's in a slot that is genuinely a rarity slot, ends up being a Voidhome, because increased item rarity does so much more in Path of Exile 2 than it does in Path of Exile 1. Now, no analogy is absolutely perfect. It's important to note that Voidhome, the real item, actually reduces your XP gain as well. So it slows down the amount of XP that you gain on your character, which is another axis of reducing your character's future power potential. But the main thing that Voidhome does is it reduces the chances you've got of getting an item to replace it, and it reduces the chances of getting items that can be a huge surge forward in power for your character. And in that way, I think that you can compare any item in Path of Exile 2 that does not have item rarity on it to be a Voidhome in many ways. It's something that might be a little bit stronger than your average rare, but it has some crushing penalty that affects your character's future progression, and one that you can't overcome just by ignoring that and equipping it. Instead, it's something that you're better off not equipping at all. So if you've got a choice between using a really good ring that has no rarity on it and a much worse ring that has rarity on it, you should see the ring that has no rarity on it as basically being a Voidhome in that slot. That is what happens because rarity is just so good. The upgrade path in Path of Exile 2 without rarity would look like this. You'd start with a magic amulet, you'd then upgrade to a 50th percentile rare, 70th percentile rare, 80th percentile rare. Might take you a little while to find the next step, but that'll be a 90th percentile rare. Then it'll take even longer to find a 93rd percentile rare. And somewhere along the lines, you might get to higher item levels as well. And higher item levels, they're just intrinsically going to be a bit better. So there's all these things that are then pushing you towards getting better and better items in your amulet slot, which increase your character power. What it actually is that you start out with a 70th percentile amulet that has no magic find on it. Then you get a rarity amulet that would be a 30th percentile amulet without the rarity, but rarity is so good that you have to use it. Your character backslides in power, but if you don't participate, your progress is undermined. Ultimately, loot across the entire game is nerfed in order to make rarity so strong on players. And this is where I think the real problem lies. All loot in the game is made worse in order to make rarity feel so strong, but this just makes rarity feel like a mandatory tax. Ultimately, if you aren't using rarity gear, some of your loot is being confiscated, and it's being redistributed to the players that already have rarity gear, the people who don't need it that much. Now, I can't escape this in real life. I'm a renter. I'm very used to having a percentage of my work taken away and redistributed up via various systems to people that have already got money. But I don't want to also experience this rich get richer mechanic in online games as well. That's the system that we've got at the moment. So yeah, if an item is rare or unique and it's in a premium rarity slot, then everything else in that slot is a Voidhome. This is the primary reason I think that Archmage builds are so dominant in softcore right now. It's noticeable that in hardcore, people are managing to keep melee builds alive. It's not like the Titan and the Warbringer are dominant ascendancies in hardcore, but they're doing okay there. And that's because in hardcore, you can't really play full-on Magic Find the way that you can in softcore. And as a result, the gear disparity between those players and the people who are playing the Archmage builds is not as big as it is in softcore. In softcore, the Archmage builds are able to run more Magic Find gear than pretty much anything else. That means they get richer. That means that every single piece of their gear gets better. And that means they end up completely eclipsing the performance of the people who are playing other builds. Also, up close and personal playstyles, they rely upon items that you can't realistically get at the same time as item rarity. For example, I would say that it would be pretty standard to want an anti-freeze and anti-stun setup if you're playing a melee build. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can do this via other methods, but typically this is going to mean having at least 2 charm slots. Well, guess what? There is only one belt that can give you increased item rarity. It's Ingenuity, and Ingenuity cannot be used with 2 charms. What this means is that if you're playing a melee build, it is much harder to fit Ingenuity on your build. You probably want to have a rare belt that has +1 or +2 charm slots on it. And that means that the absolute most that you can get is the very low uptime of a gold charm. That's the most magic find that you can get out of your belt, and that is nothing compared to what Ingenuity can provide. So this means that your belt is functionally a Voidhome. It is something that is not advancing your magic find, and as a result, you fall behind the rest of the Trade League economy. Rare belts are a millstone holding back your item progression because they are not Ingenuity. Gets even worse when we look at the shield slot. Mahuxotl's Machination with the Rarity Soul Core. If you get a perfect roll on this, it's 228% rarity. That's pretty unreasonable. That's like really, really, really ridiculous. But if you had, say, a 592% increased effective Soul Cores on this, and then you got 3 Soul Core slots on it through a lucky Valorb, then you're looking at 207% increased item rarity on this, and that's more accessible than 228. That is such a ridiculously large number that you just can't justify anything else in that slot, no matter the power cost. What this means is that shapeshifting mechanics, of which we've currently only got the demon form from the Infernalist, but we're soon going to have the Druid as well, all of these are going to be unsuitable for any sort of real endgame mapping, because farming maps is so much better with Mahuxotls that you would be better off dropping 3 or 4 or even 5 tiers, running a Mahuxotl setup and not using your transformation, than you would be playing with more character power, but going into this transformation setting. Ultimately, there is no point in Grenier Games releasing the Druid until they deal with the item rarity problem. Now, the real killer here is that rarity applies to currency and has a huge level of control over which currency drops. So this will mean that instead of getting a Regal Shard, you get a Regal Orb with a high amount of rarity. Instead of getting an Exalted Orb, you'll sometimes get a Divine Orb. All these sorts of currency tier-ups will take place when you've got enough rarity on your character. Unless you have quite a large amount of player-based item rarity, ultra rare currencies, so this is the Divine, the Annul, the Mirror, these almost can't drop at all. Currency drops are also pre-nerfed in order to make Rarity so compelling, and that I think is the real problem here. It's not that if you don't engage in Rarity, you get the intended loot. No, you get less than the intended amount of loot if you don't engage in interacting with the Rarity system. Ultimately, I feel at the moment, this is the one killer problem with Path of Exile 2. The loot system just doesn't work at Endgame, and the intended incentive to push players towards higher tier content and towards making more powerful characters isn't functioning. Instead, you're being pushed to do something else. There's been a couple of recent comments that people have been making claiming Rarity hits hard diminishing returns after 100%. Now in Path of Exile 1 there is diminishing returns on player-based item Rarity, and it does kick in somewhere around 75% or so. The formula is a bit better known in POE 1. In POE 2 we don't know the exact formula, but from analysing the number of middling drops, and here we're talking things like Exalted Orbs, Chaos Orbs and the like, from super juiced content. And here we're talking about when you get a stars aligned combination of setups, so you get a whole bunch of breaches procking on one map. There's one of the breach nodes that gives you a chance to get 10 additional breaches. When that procs, you'll see that when people are running situations where they've got more like 180% rarity, they seem to typically be getting about 80 Exalted Orbs per map when they get this rare proc. Now that's not 80 Exalted Orbs every map they run, that's when they get this super rare proc that comes up. When you get people that are running more like 500% rarity, those players are getting closer to 200, 220. So this is the sort of big gulf that seems to exist still. I think there's more testing that needs to be done on this, but for the moment, I think that while it is probably diminishing returns, it's still the case that rarity is the most powerful stat in the game. Now, there was one study that was done on Reddit that came up with quite different results, but this was done on normal rarity maps, and it was done on maps that were run with no league events on them. I don't think that this is representative of where loot really drops in the game. So whilst I did come up with some conclusions indicating that maybe there's some diminishing returns that kick in, it wasn't as compelling as people made it out to be. A serious test though, if people want to run it, would be to count the loot that drops solely from 100 breaches, and run 100 breaches at various configurations of rarity on players. This would be something that would get to the bottom, and really the main things you want would be the number of Exalted Orbs, the number of Chance Orbs, and the number of Divine Orbs that drop, because that would give you a real sense as to what exactly is going on. But this is not really happening at the moment. And why breach? Because it's where so much of the loot is in normal maps. Now it is worth saying there are some mechanics that do bypass rarity a bit. Ritual, for instance, doesn't really interact with rarity that much. So if you don't have any rarity at all, then running Ritual is something that you can do that will still work for you. Although a lot of the loot in Ritual is tied to that Ingenuity belt, and that Ingenuity belt comes from the King in the Mist, which you'll get invitations to once every now and again when you're running Rituals. So that's something that you can run if you're not running Rarity. It's not like it applies to every single section of the game, but it is still something that is extremely, extremely significant. That's enough talking about Magic Find. Let's talk about the other thing that irks me the most in Path of Exile 2. This is what I term gotcha moments and anti-game chores. These are things you need to do in order to continue progression that are just annoying, and sometimes where the game goes, haha, you forgot to do this, here's a whole bunch of consequences for not doing one of these chores. The single worst of these is the well. In Path of Exile 1, simply returning to town through a town portal was sufficient to get your flasks refilled, was sufficient to get your life recovered, your mana recovered, and if this system was in Path of Exile 2, it would also apply to your charms. There have been 4 times so far that I have forgotten to use the well when I've been at 0 life flask charges. 2 of these I realized quickly. When I did that, it's a disappointing groan and an, I've got to go back to town again, sit through another couple of load screens. Nothing fun about it, but at least nothing worse has happened. The other 2 times I died, both of those times I rage logged and didn't log back on for the night, because it's just one of those things that Path of Exile 1 has solved this problem. Path of Exile 2 has then gone and reintroduced it just to mess with people. 100% fine to dying to a combat mistake, but dying to a forgotten chore, this is not fun at all. And even when you remember, it feels bad. You've then got to go and walk over to it and walk back. There's a wasted 6 seconds or so. Functionally, it's just an extra load screen. The load screens in Path of Exile 2 are worse than the ones in Path of Exile 1. The last thing that you need is adding an additional one. But I think it gets a lot worse when you think about the optimization in towns. Towns in Path of Exile 2 have unusually bad performance for this game. So this is not just a load screen. This is a load screen where your PC is running hot. Your fan is starting to rev up really high, and your PC is ejecting a whole bunch of heat into your room. Now, I know a lot of people who are watching this video, you're from the United States, you're from Canada, you're from Germany, you're from places where it's winter at the moment, and having an extra 800 watt heater running is not the worst thing in the world. I'm in Australia. We've had a couple of heat waves here. The last thing I want on a 35-degree day or a 41-degree day, which is 95 to 105 Fahrenheit, for those of you that think in Fahrenheit, the last thing I want is my PC spiking to 800, 850 watt power draw just in order to render some of the rubbish in towns. So this means that tapping the well is also actually ejecting a whole bunch of heat into my room, which is something I really, really don't need during summer. I don't mind when the PC's power draw spikes up to full for something exciting, like you're fighting a boss and there's a whole bunch of extra things on the screen, but when it's for some silly little mechanic like the well, it's really frustrating. There's a few other town chores as well. There's visiting the Disenchanter, the Reforging Bench, the Shattering Bench. I think these are a bit less of an issue. They're still frustrating. I don't think these are as bad though, because there's something that do provide a little bit of agency early in the game, and they don't keep coming up. Once you've got 5 Regals banked, 5 Artificers Orbs banked, at that point, they don't end up being a problem. But all of this is more disruptive to gameplay than vendoring in Path of Exile 1, and it's worse again because of the fact that PCs run hot in towns. That, I think, is a thing that really makes it worse than it would otherwise be. While we're talking about the Reforging Bench, the lack of documentation about it in-game is just exactly what the Path of Exile 1 vendor recipe system had. The difference is that in Path of Exile 1, the vendor recipes, at least there's a couple of places that come up really high when you do a Google search for them. You got the Path of Exile wiki, has a definitive page on all of the vendor recipes in the game. That comes up really quickly when you do a Google search for it. Well, in Path of Exile 2, there's no real documentation for the Reforging Bench. And while talking about little anti-game chores, I will say that Act 3's time travel mechanic, it's kind of cool, but the implementation of it, the fact that there's no way to just waypoint between the two different time zone towns, this is something that's really frustrating, especially if you get a trade while you are in the latter quarter of Act 3. That can be really frustrating because then suddenly you've got a town portal, then after your town portal, you've then got to go through the time portal, and then after you go through that, you can then finally warp to where the other player is. This is really frustrating here. Act 2's map use can be a bit over the top too, but I think it's Act 3 where that becomes the most annoying. While we're on anti-game chores, some non-combat areas take too long to traverse. The main one I'm talking about here is Sanctum and Ultimatum. Now this is me naming them in accordance with my POE 1 brain. Sanctum is the Path of Exile 1 term for the Trials of the Sekhemas, and Ultimatum is the Path of Exile 1 term for Trials of Chaos. You will hear these terms a lot. If you're a Path of Exile 2 only player, if someone refers to those terms, that's what they mean, and that's why they get these wrong names. Not the actual combat areas in them, but the areas that you're not fighting anything, you're just progressing to the next part of the challenge. There's so much scenery-induced downtime that I'm not really interested in running these mechanics, despite the fact that I probably would be otherwise. I would rather buy a carry through them. And the sizes of these areas are balanced around Path of Exile 1 endgame movement speed. So when you've got Mage Blood equipped, you're moving at 11, 12 meters per second in Path of Exile 1. And that seems to be what some of the scenery, especially in Ultimatum, is balanced around, that sort of movement speed. Path of Exile 2 movement speed is more like 4.5 meters a second. So basically adding 150% more movement speed buff to moving through all of these Ultimatum areas, and maybe 75% in the Sanctum, this would be an absolute godsend because those areas just drag at the moment. They're not fun, they're not very exciting, they look cool, but that only matters once. Perhaps the overall worst gotcha moment though is that there's the option to take Chaos Resistance as one of your quest rewards. This is arguably the strongest of the quest rewards that you can get at that choice, but then later on, that character respecs to Chaos Inoculation. Well then, at this point, they've got no way to respec into the correct choice for the build now. There was an equivalent issue to this back in Path of Exile 1, and in patch 1.0.1, which I believe was probably in 2014, Grungy Games fixed that. They added respec options to the Deal with the Bandits quest. Something similar needs to come in Path of Exile 2. Alright, well let's talk about respecing of a different type, rune swapping. This is another major complaint with the game at the moment. Unswappability of runes, in my opinion, is a lesser form of bound to character. So items being bound to character is a way of completely sabotaging their appeal to anyone else, in exchange potentially for them being a little bit better than they'd otherwise be. To get the 12% fire res from a desert rune, you need to make the item permanently less appealing. Not completely unappealing the way that bound to character would, but permanently less appealing to every other player, and that's a prerequisite to get that extra bit of power. Unlike binding an item to your character though, applying a rune to an item also has this problem of making it less appealing to your future self. Your future character might have different strengths and different weaknesses, and you can't adjust that item in order to account for those different strengths and different weaknesses later on. Other comparable things in Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 are completely respecable. If you spec Chaos Resistance on the passive tree, you aren't stuck with it forever. If you decide later, you know what, I don't want this Chaos Res anymore, I'm running Chaos Inoculation, you can then just unspec that Chaos Resistance on the tree. Likewise, in Path of Exile 1, the crafting bench. Anything that you put on with it, unless you corrupt the item, anything you put on with it is something that can be overwritten with something else. Now, I get why Grinding Games did this. There are a couple of unique items that are chase endgame uniques, Moria Invictus and Mahuxotl's Machination. Both of these are high-end boss drops, and both of them feel like it is appropriate for them not to be able to have runes swapped in them, because they have specific synergies with the runes that are in there. Those items should just have the text, runes in this item cannot be overwritten, and then the real issue, permanently locking in runes feeling miserable, can be addressed here. That way you wouldn't have the situation where even in hardcore, people are not using a resist rune because they're not sure what they're going to need later, and they know they're going to be juggling around their gear on their character for a while. This sort of segues us into talking about crafting, and a lot of people talk about Path of Exile 2's crafting being weak. Some of the complaints that I've seen, people say there's no crafting system, just a gambling system. This is not a rare refrain at all. I think that this is a design pillar of Path of Exile 2 rather than a mistake. This doesn't mean that everyone's going to like it, but I want to unpack this. And I want to start with a question. What is it that turns loot into ground clutter? And here, I believe the answer is obsolescence. It is either the expectation or the reality that you can easily craft a better item. For example, in Path of Exile 1, if you get a 2-stone ring that drops in early maps, you're going to identify it and possibly put something on it from the crafting bench, and then think this is probably going to be an upgrade for your character unless it's unlucky. You're going to think, okay, this has some chance of being genuine loot. By the time that you get to endgame though, you're confident that you can always craft better than pretty much anything you pick up off the ground, unless it's, you get stars aligned luck. And so that means those items on the ground aren't something that you consider at all. You might pick up the very best bases only. So in Path of Exile 1, the approach is as follows. Let crafting be so good, at least at endgame, that all ground loot becomes ground clutter. So ground loot only matters if it exceeds normal limitation in a way that currency can't replicate. So for instance, you get a 29% quality necrotic armor. That is really, really big value loot in Path of Exile 1. It could have useful effects that only the very, very rarest currency could mimic. For example, if you were to pick up a set of gloves in Path of Exile 1 and they've got top tier fractured suppression on them, that's going to be something that's genuine loot rather than ground clutter. Or it could have a stars aligned combination of drops that end up being useful in some way. For instance, if an item drops simultaneously Hunter Influence and Corrupted, it might get a Hunter Influenced explicit modifier that is Curse on Hit, and the corruption implicit on it might be immunity to bleed. This is an extremely unlikely outcome, it's an extremely strong one. Or the last way in which an item can be ground loot rather than ground clutter is if it can be usefully destroyed in an RNG crafting effort of some description. This includes all currency items, but it also includes a few other things. For example, middle tier uniques that can be usefully varled are another thing in this category. So the POE 1 norm is that you block non-consumable items from appearing on your loot filter quite comprehensively. You might run a map where 5,000 rare items drop and exactly 2 of them show up on your loot filter, and you might run a map where 5,000 rare items drop and exactly 0 show up on your loot filter. There are exceptions, but they're few and far between. And fundamentally what we're seeing here is in Path of Exile 1, crafting is so strong that nerfs otherwise exciting drops that appear on the ground to the point that they become ground clutter through obsolescence. Because you know that even if it is a top 1 in a million item that you identify as ground loot, you can craft something better than it reasonably accessibly. PoE 2 decides to go a very different approach, where the best loot starts its life as a monster drop. They're a monster drop that is an extremely good starting point. Maybe they're a tier 5 unidentified rare, a tier 4 unidentified rare, they ID pretty well, they're on a good base, and then you get a stars aligned combination of mods. Then after you've got this starting point, limited crafting tools exist. They do exist, but there's limited ones that exist to further improve the item. So in theory, you kill monsters with huge rarity bonuses, and this is both the monster's inherent rarity, this is zone rarity, as well as player rarity, and then those monsters drop items that are better than anything you could realistically craft. And then after that, you can take RNG steps to further improve the item, One of these is applying a Val Orb. One is Omen annulling it, so trying to remove a specific mod surgically. One is to Omen of Whittling and Chaos Orb it, which is another way that you can remove a certain mod with a fair degree of control, although of course you could get rubbish in its place. Or if you want to do this on more of a budget, you can just simply RNG improve it through the use of Exalted Orbs and some of the deterministic steps like Arcanist Etches or Artificer's Orbs. Are there other options though? I think it's worth looking for inspiration at Last Epoch. Now, I think Last Epoch's crafting system is perfectly designed for the first 30 to 40 hours of gameplay per cycle in that game, after which it starts to hit its own problems. The crafting system in that game is not quite an item editor when it comes to low and medium quality rares, but it's pretty close to being one. Any set of 4 mods that are tier 5 or lower can probably be crafted within about 20 attempts on any particular base. So in Last Epoch, you've got a lot of control over getting the basics of an item right. But if you want to go further than that, then you need either a beyond normal limit starting point, an exalted item as they're called in that game, and they're RNG drops only, or you need account bound runes that can provide something akin to a Path of Exile fracturing orb that's not exactly the same, or you can destroy a lot of good items trying legendary crafting. And so you go through this point where there's a whole bunch of easy crafting up to a certain point, then beyond that, there's a huge wall of RNG that kicks in. Deterministic to early endgame, highly RNG gated beyond that. That's the Last Epoch way. It's a way that works. It's not necessarily something that I'm advocating for Path of Exile 2, but it's one that at least should be considered. Now, Path of Exile 1 briefly had a Last Epoch-like system. This is the short period 3.5, 3.6, 3.7, where multi-mod was at full power. Now, while this was creating rare items, it felt a lot like you were vendor purchasing unique items. What you would tend to do is roll an item to get one perfect mod on it. This would be a magic item with one perfect mod. Then you would apply a Regal Orb to it and hope to annul off the new mod that you added. And then after that, you would multi-mod it and you would put 4 crafted mods of your choice on it. So essentially, it was kind of like you were buying a unique item from the vendor that had the stats that you got from all of those multi-mod things that you had on it. That's the reason I always thought of it as vendor purchased uniques. This is back in the days when in Path of Exile 1, Exalted Orbs were the expensive currency and Divines were cheap. And generally speaking, these crafts cost about 5 or 6 or 7 Exalted Orbs at the time. Now, the impact of this setup was that all upper to middle level crafting in those item slots pretty much died away. It got replaced by these pseudo vendor uniques. Grinding Gear Games then didn't like this, and a lot of players didn't like it either. There was just this similarity in the gearing that people were using. And so Grinding Gear Games then removed all of the really deterministic ways to mass produce items that casual players could never hope to grow past. And that was Grinding Gear Games' response when there was something more Last Epoch-like in Path of Exile 1. It was pretty much to remove it. I'm for something else here. What I think would be a better system than either of these will be to have a situation where there's powerful crafting systems, but they're quarantined to only one item slot. So for instance, you could have it so that essences, they become way better than they are in Path of Exile 2, but they're gloves only. And so most players would build up gloves using essence crafting. That would be the default way that you would get really good gloves on your character. But you might find something that's fantastic from an unidentified tier 5 rare, and potentially that might have different stats to what the usual essence setups would have. Another thing you could have, Path of Exile 1's Harvest, but only on belts. Of course, that's not going to happen while Ingenuity is as good as it is now, but still worth thinking about. And what this would allow to happen is that ground loot would still matter, but at the same time, you'd have a bit more agency over the direction of certain items on your character. Another thing I think we should consider is that unidentified tier 2 rare items should be more common and should appear in the campaign. These are not sublime items. These are just better than a normal rare, but they're not outclassing normal rares. You can still get quite unlucky with them. I feel like one of these could drop for the first time kill of each act boss in the game, so players get introduced to this system a bit earlier in the game. I did survey some people as to when they first found a tier 2 unidentified rare item, and it turned out that for most people, it was in early endgame. It was in white maps. So people weren't seeing them through the campaign. It seems like it is an endgame only system, albeit an endgame only system that can theoretically occur earlier. And for about a quarter to a third of the people I surveyed, they did get one in the campaign. The chance to get these from act bosses at the moment might be being held down as a consequence of Magic Find, and as a consequence of the fact that loot has to be pre-nerfed to allow for the fact that players can stack so much rarity. So if you don't have rarity, maybe you're either incapable of getting these to drop, or it's just so rare that it's not going to happen in practice until you get into endgame proper. Once you do get into endgame proper though, you will start seeing them whether you've got Rarity or not, but it's likely that if Rarity gets overhauled, aka completely removed, then in that situation, you'll have more of these dropping earlier in the campaign because your loot won't be pre-nerfed to allow for the amount that Rarity allows it to scale. I want to jump back to that concept of interconnectedness that we discussed early on. Path of Exile 2 made a design decision to introduce chance orbs that are good, not the chance orbs that are rubbish in Path of Exile 1. Now, they're a lot rarer, the Path of Exile 2 ones than POE 1 ones were. The existence of these means that Scoured items can't be awarded as freely as they were in Path of Exile 1, and this has flow-on effects to other items as well. For example, there are 3 item bases: the Stellar Amulet, the Sapphire Ring, the Azure Amulet. There might actually be more that I can't think of. These are the 3 that come to mind for me. Applying any of the currencies that only work on a normal item, Transmutation, Alchemy Orb, Essence, to one of these bases is just a big mistake. You're destroying something where the best use case for it by far is to sell it to someone that's doing chance orbing. And that's something that ends up being a bit problematic because these are pretty compelling bases to use. And so a whole bunch of crafting ends up feeling really bad on them as a result. Anyways, that's just something about the way that various mechanics interact with each other. I'm quite happy with chance orbs. I think this is a price that's worth paying, but it is a price that we are paying for them to be this good. All right, let's jump over and talk about character balance now. This looks like crisis levels at first, but honestly, I think at the moment we're seeing Magic Find warping everything. Currently, something like 50% of high-level players are playing Stormweavers, but this is only the case in softcore. In hardcore, the Stormweaver is still popular, but it's nothing like that. There's actually more balance there, and even life-based melee, even life and armor-based melee, is doing better in hardcore than it is in softcore. We already talked a little bit about that earlier, but I also think in softcore, if you want to build a good Warbringer, the best way to do it is to start out by leveling a Stormweaver, Magic Find with it, build up a whole bunch of gear that way, then sell some of that gear and buy some of the items that have dropped, some of those tier 5 unidentified rares that have dropped for other players and have ended up being really good stats for a Warbringer. Buy them and then hand them over to a new character that you make that is a Warbringer. This is the messy spot we're in at the moment, and it's why Magic Find is really warping a lot of the balance issues in the game. The people who are engaging in Magic Find have much, much, much better gear than the people who aren't, and as a result, they end up just being completely dominant when it comes to all discussion about game balance at the moment. So let's think, for instance, about the life versus ES setup. Most people at the moment think that life and evasion characters are underperforming slightly. Energy shield and armor characters are also slightly underperforming. Energy shield evasion and pure energy shield characters are overperforming, and life armor and life armor evasion builds are all woeful. But this could just be a case of Magic Find distorting things, because in hardcore trade, Magic Find is less of an issue, and that means that life armor based characters are actually performing adequately there. They're not doing well, but they're doing a bit better. And so what we've got at the moment is a problem where character balance is just hidden. The decision not to put life percent on the passive tree, but to put energy shield percent there though, this is going to probably never work long term. I don't think that this is something that can be balanced in the long term. Energy shield characters currently have the agency that they can scale defense or damage with their passive tree, whereas life builds at the moment, they need some of that agency. At the moment, they only have the agency to scale into damage on the passive tree. They have some other defensive layers they can use as well, but primarily they don't really have anywhere near as much agency, and this is a real problem, even though I will acknowledge that life nodes cause a lot of problems in Path of Exile 1. I don't know what the solution here is, but the current status quo is really, really bad. All right, so let's talk about the 1 portal versus 6 portal situation. When I talk about 1 portal here, what I mean is that if you die in Path of Exile 1, you can go back into the map, you can use a second portal to do so. In Path of Exile 2, you cannot. All of that discussion of interconnectedness early. The reason we talked about it is because we're going to be talking about it a lot here with portals. In Path of Exile 1, having 6 portal meta causes a lot of problems, and they're hidden because they're all people have ever known. In Path of Exile 1, bosses feel like slot machines because player skill does not matter. Once you meet a certain minimum character power limit, which does vary a bit from boss to boss, but once you get to that limit, then you pretty much can't fail the boss no matter how many mistakes you make on it. That's because you can burst the boss down in a very short period of time, and if you do die to something, you can just come back in and do it again. So once you buy the entry ticket, you're guaranteed to succeed once you meet that certain gear threshold. Now, not everyone ever gets to that threshold, but enough people do that the trade league economy balances around this. And so the assumption is everyone that runs a boss, they're always going to win. And so the entry ticket goes up in price, the loot from the boss goes down in price, and it feels like a slot machine to run. The entire cause of this problem, which is one of the most common complaints people have about bossing in Path of Exile 1, is the 6 portal system. One portal, however, causes different issues, and we can't test all of them because of Magic Find being so dominant. The single worst issue with the 1 portal meta is Untelegraphed one-shots. This is something that will be fixed over time, but it's something that's going to feel mediocre while they work on fixing those. The second worst issue is when the monster dies, but you die before you can scoop the loot in the map. This one I think needs a fix. There needs to be some sort of design change. I don't know what exactly it is, whether it's players getting a short period of invulnerability after killing a major boss, whether it be something else entirely, but I do think that this needs to be fixed. There are also a number of other options grinding your games could consider. There is an in-the-middle option. Now, some people's idea of an in-the-middle option is to have 2 or 3 portals with Path of Exile 1 rules, but I feel like a better solution if they wanted to go down this route will be to have some number of portals, but all monsters fully heal when a player dies. I'm not sure I'm advocating this. I just think it's something that could be considered. It's still a considerable difficulty nerf though, and that means that you are moving back into some of those problems from Path of Exile 1's 6 portal meta. But what if it's actually a different issue that is causing all of the real problems? Failing endgame bosses in Path of Exile 2 is a crushing setback. And the reason for this is that Path of Exile 2 has made a design decision to make bosses rare but very rewarding. And these bosses are an ordeal to access. You need to run a lot of content in order to get another Breachstone together, in order to get another audience with the king together, etc, etc. The entry tokens to the bosses are really rare, and then the drop rates from the bosses are really high. There's no 1 to 2% drop rates. Most of the chase items from the bosses, in fact most of the items full stop, they have drop rates in the 15% range. The Ingenuity belt may even be 1 in 3. What if we kept the 1 portal meta, but fixed it so that portals reopen after the boss dies, but we make it so that the amount of effort that's needed to access one of the bosses is decreased by 2/3, and we also drop the drop rates by a factor of 2/3. And then if a player doesn't get a unique item from the boss, then they get some sort of consolation prize, which is probably a high tier unidentified rare item. I think this would address the real issue with bossing, but it would do so in a way that doesn't bring back the problems that Path of Exile 1 had, that Path of Exile 2 has managed to solve. So what about portals in a map context? Because we've been talking about bosses so far. In maps, I really want to try out the 1 portal meta once some of the most egregious character balance issues get fixed, and once monster damage gets retuned a little bit. This can't happen while Magic Find exists, so step 1 is to remove Magic Find. Step 2 is to balance Energy Shield, Evasion, Armor, and also the Life and Energy Shield scale. And then step 3 is reassess the portal situation, once we've had a chance to seriously play with it, after some of the most egregious balance outliers have been fixed. Somewhat related to this is the idea of on-death effects from monsters. Now, I think some of these are fundamentally fair and some of them are fundamentally unfair. The fundamentally fair ones do damage that is not lethal to a character that's paid attention to their defenses, and those ones exist to keep glass cannon playstyles under control. One of the most unsatisfying things in Path of Exile 1 has been those metas where a glass cannon playstyle is just the objectively correct way to play the game. Those end up feeling quite unsatisfying, in my opinion, for a lot of players. You want to have a situation where that's not the objectively correct way to play the game, but potentially it can be an option, and people that like it, they can always go and do Temporalis runs in the Trials of the Sekhema. That's the purpose that on-death effects serve. The problem is, at the moment, they're not very well balanced, and some of them are one-shotting tanky characters, some of them are not even tickling a squishy character. You want them in a situation where, at high level, they can one-shot a very squishy character, but they won't one-shot a character that is well defended. And additionally, you should consider the idea that they could debuff rather than kill. A heinous 60% shock or 60% slow, these are sorts of things that can really impact a glass cannon build, but they also don't feel quite as catastrophic to be hit with as something that just outright kills your character. Also want to talk about my other major complaint about Endgame, which is going to be layouts. Backtracking in maps feels awful. Far worse than it does in Path of Exile 1. There's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, in Path of Exile 1, you seldom run layouts like Cursed Crypt. I'm using Cursed Crypt as an example here because it's in the lowest quarter of maps. It's not necessarily one of the absolute worst. It's not dungeon, but it's also not very good. Now, when you're running a Cursed Crypt, your backtracking typically is done at 170% base movement speed or higher, because you've got a Quicksilver Flask. This is the key difference. In Path of Exile 2, your backtracking is super, super slow when you have to do it. Also, there's more layouts like Cursed Crypt. You have less tells as to where to go, and you need to go to more places on each map. Needing to kill every single rare monster in maps, this really exacerbates this. I'd like to see changes on some maps to attempt mechanic X, so for instance it might be attempt to complete the breach, kill 70% of monsters present, kill all but one rare monster. A whole lot of things like that could be more interesting than just always having the same mechanics. We also have less agency over the layouts we run, and the worst layouts are worse than the worst layouts in Path of Exile 1. Example here, you have the levers in Augury. These things take forever to pull, and you also can't cancel them, and so they're a complete death trap. You have to kind of clear a fair way around the lever before you pull it, otherwise you can wind up getting surprised and killed. Now, I do think that Augury specifically is grinding your games trolling us Toucan enjoyers. Now, you'll probably see that I'm wearing a Toucan shirt here. I do have these for sale in my merch store at the moment. I think this might just be grinding your games trolling people who like Toucan memes like myself. The decision to make Augury that bad because it does have a Toucan on a pedestal in the middle of it, and it's a map that's unequivocally the worst one in the game. That said, we do have to do that map a lot. It's not like it's once a league the way it would have been in Path of Exile 1. In my opinion, I think a percentage of Atlas nodes should be favored maps, with one favorite map unlockable per biome. And when you haven't allocated a favorite map, it should be something fairly bad like Augury, and then it will feel really good when you do unlock one of your favorite maps. That's something I'd like to see changed reasonably soon. But when we're talking about bad layouts, towers. These are bad solo, they're worse in group play, unbelievably bad in group play, and unbelievably worse again if you're playing with minions. The layouts are terrible, they go on forever, we haven't yet worked out any tells for navigating them, so it just ends up being really miserable. At the same time, you also want to run these with a cheap and nasty map, like an out-leveled low-tier Waystone, so that you spend the minimum possible time there because it's such a miserable layout. Surely there can be other layouts for towers. Already in the game, Act 2, there's the Halani Gates. These are a good tower biome that already exist. They have the first version of Jamanra, so not Jamanra the Abomination. I think it's called Jamanra the Risen King. The first version of Jamanra, you fight him there. And this is not a fantastic zone, but at least it's different to the one where you fight Torghul the Defiler later in Act 2 that becomes the basis of the towers, and it's something that's also a little bit more open. There's also the Act 1 Mana Zone, which is much more open again, and would also fit the theme of a tower. So we already have towers in the game. It's not like this would be something that requires new layouts to be made. There's other suggestions people have had as well, which is that you could have just a normal map, like any of the maps that exist in the game, but then at the end there's an entrance to a tower that appears there. That would be something that might require a bit more programming, but that could also be a good solution as well. You could then have towers that would appear on a Savannah map, but once you run across the Savannah map, instead of having to kill every rare monster there, you just have to get to the end, then there's a tower, and maybe there's 3 packs of monsters inside the tower, and then you get to activate your precursor beacon. There's a number of things that you could do like that, but ultimately, the current system is really miserable. Tower layouts are terrible. Another endgame issue comes up, and that is variance. RNG on access to the Arbiter of Ash is probably a bit extreme at the moment, but I think a lot of these issues could also be solved by something we were talking about before when we were talking about bossing, which is that they could make the boss 2 to 3 times as common, and then remove some of the loot from it. If you do that, then suddenly it doesn't feel so bad for the Arbiter of Ash if you don't get it quickly, because it will come. I have one final complaint about endgame, and this is the process of earning Atlas points. You need to do expensive invites in order to unlock the ritual tree in particular. The ritual tree is the most extreme of these because the invites are so expensive because ingenuity is so good. Now this is the more extreme version, but it's an issue as well for Breach, for Delirium, for Expedition. In Path of Exile 1, Uber Pinnacle boss access keys were decoupled from the base key, and so was the loot. This should be considered in Path of Exile 2 as well. If this was done, then you would be able to have cheaper versions that would allow you to do the base version of these fights, and then you wouldn't need to be throwing multiple 7 divine invitations at your own unlocking of the ritual tree, which is something that's fine if you get an ingenuity on your first run, but many people will not get an ingenuity on their first run, or even on their second, third, or fourth, or fifth, because 30% doesn't mean that you get one guaranteed after 3 or 4 runs. It just means that on average you get about 1 every 3 or 4 runs. Anyways, I wanted to finish with a happier note and remind people that the game is still good. It's really polished from levels 1 to 77, so everything there is really good, But beyond that, Magic Find causes so many problems that I feel like you may as well just get to level 77 for now, then walk away until grinding your games fix the Magic Find debacle. I'm going to leave it there. May Orbs have interesting results, and I will see you around.